She gave a stranger $5 on a bus, never imagining it would change an entire community. But when a mysterious donation appeared and powerful figures got involved, everything Claire believed was put to the test. What happened next will surprise you. Where are you watching this from? Share with me in the comments below. Claire Thompson clutched her scarf tightly as the cold air cut through her coat. The city's December chill wrapped around her like an unrelenting shroud as she quickened her steps toward the bus stop. Snowflakes swirled under the flickering streetlights, dusting the sidewalk in a thin, fragile blanket of white. It had been another long, draining day at Grant & Myers Creative Design, where Claire worked as a graphic designer. The weight of deadlines and client demands seemed to gnaw at her more during the season of joy, they said. Reaching the bus stop, Claire let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as she leaned against the icy shelter. Her reflection peered back faintly from the foggy glass, and for a moment she studied herself. Tired eyes, faint lines around her mouth, and a face that had forgotten how to smile without effort. At 42, Claire's life had become a quiet rhythm of routines. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. She often wondered if this was all there was, this dull cycle of existing without ever really living. The distant hum of the bus broke her thoughts. She straightened, huffing warm air into her hands as the vehicle creaked to a stop before her. The door hissed open, and Claire climbed aboard, the sharp scent of damp coats and diesel exhaust meeting her senses. The bus was packed, tired faces staring into nothing, a sea of phones glowing dimly like tiny lanterns. Claire found a spot near the middle, clutching the pole as the bus jerked into motion. Outside, faint glimmers of Christmas lights blinked through the fogged-up windows. Holiday cheer pressed up against a world too busy to notice. She tried not to think about how lonely Christmas would feel this year, just like the last. The ride continued in its mundane rhythm, stop, jerk, hum, repeat, until a sudden disruption pulled Claire from her reverie. The bus door opened and an older man climbed aboard slowly, his thin frame shivering beneath a threadbare coat. He clutched a faded hat in one hand, his face lined with deep creases that spoke of years weathered and worn. Claire watched as he approached the driver, his movements stiff and deliberate, as if every step cost him energy he couldn't afford to spare. "Fare's $2.50, the driver grumbled, his voice clipped with irritation. The man, clearly flustered, patted his pockets, pulling out a handful of crumpled bills and a few coins. He hesitated, his rough, calloused hands trembling slightly as he counted. $1. Another. But it wasn't enough. I don't have it," the man whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engine. The bus fell uncomfortably silent, passengers glancing up briefly before returning to their phones or gazing out the window. The driver sighed loudly, tapping his fingers impatiently on the wheel. "Sir, if you don't have the full fare, you'll have to get off." Claire's chest tightened as she watched the scene unfold. The man's shoulders sagged under the weight of the driver's words. His eyes darted to the floor, shame coloring his face. It was a look Claire recognized all too well, a look of defeat, of feeling small under the crushing weight of life's unfairness. Her heart pounded as she glanced around. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence felt suffocating, like a heavy blanket pressing down on her. Claire clenched her purse strap tightly, her thoughts spinning. Someone should do something, shouldn't they? But no one did. Memories flashed unbidden. Her mother's face when they lost their house all those years ago. The stranger who slipped an envelope of money into her father's hand at church. Back then, someone had stepped forward. Now, it was her turn. "Wait!" Claire's voice rose louder than she intended, startling even herself. Heads turned, and Claire felt her face flush under the sudden attention. She dug into her purse, her fingers brushing past receipts and keys until she found a crumpled $5 bill. Without meeting anyone's gaze, she stepped forward and held it out toward the driver. "I'll pay for him," she said firmly, her voice steadier this time. The driver raised an eyebrow but shrugged, taking the bill and punching the fare into the system. "Suit yourself." The older man turned to Claire, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "Ma'am, you didn't have to," he said softly, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotion. Claire forced a small, awkward smile. "It's nothing, really." She quickly returned to her spot, suddenly hyper-aware of the curious eyes watching her. She gripped the pole tightly, her face warm, but deep inside, an unexpected calm settled over her. The man shuffled toward the back of the bus, clutching his hat as though it were something precious. Claire avoided looking around, instead fixing her gaze on the foggy window as the bus resumed its jerky rhythm. Outside, the lights of Christmas decorations blurred in the darkness, glowing faintly like quiet beacons of hope. When her stop arrived, Claire rose and made her way toward the exit. She glanced back one last time as the bus doors closed behind her. Through the haze of the glass, she saw the older man sitting quietly, his hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. But another figure caught her attention. A man sitting a few rows back, partially obscured by shadows. His eyes seemed fixed on her, watching intently. Claire shook it off as her boots crunched against the snow-covered pavement. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she hurried down the sidewalk, her apartment building just ahead. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, like a flicker of light in the darkness. As Claire reached for her apartment door, she paused. The bus ride replayed in her mind, the older man's face, the quiet gratitude in his eyes. And yet that other passenger's gaze lingered, unsettled and watchful. Claire turned to glance back down the street, but the bus had already disappeared into the night. The next morning, Claire awoke to the soft patter of snow against her window. The faint glow of dawn bled through the curtains, casting muted light across her modest apartment. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her worn slippers as the events of the previous night filtered back into her thoughts. The older man on the bus, the trembling hands, the gratitude in his voice. She shook her head, brushing it off as she stood up. It was just $5, Claire muttered to herself. Anyone would have done it. She repeated the words like a mantra as she moved through her small kitchen, pouring coffee into her travel thermos. Outside, the Pennsylvania winter was in full force. Snowflakes swirled in lazy spirals, coating the streets and sidewalks in an icy layer of slush. Claire bundled herself in her old coat, the one with the frayed sleeves that still kept her warm, and set out for work, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. As she trudged through the biting wind, Claire tried to focus on the day ahead. The firm had a major pitch to prepare, and the holiday season meant tight deadlines and impatient clients. Still, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of the older man's face, the mix of embarrassment and gratitude etched so clearly in his expression. By the time Claire pushed through the glass doors of Grant & Myers, the small office was already buzzing with energy. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. It was a typical morning in the days leading up to Christmas, chaotic, hurried, and heavy with expectation. "Claire!" Lucy Myers' bright voice rang out over the noise as Claire peeled off her coat. Lucy, Claire's younger co-worker, bounded over with her usual bundle of energy. Her dark curls bounced as she thrust a donut toward Claire with a grin. "Lighten up, Thompson, it's Christmas. You look like you need a little sugar boost." Claire smiled faintly, taking the donut but tucking it into a napkin. "Thanks, Lucy, I'll save it for later." Lucy tilted her head, studying Claire with playful suspicion. "You're always so mysterious. What's going on in that brain of yours? Secret double life?" "Not likely," Claire replied with a small laugh, brushing past to her desk. She sank into her chair with a relieved sigh, her fingers already reaching for the mouse to start her work. But her attention caught and froze when she spotted it. Sitting perfectly centered on her desk was a massive bouquet of flowers, blue hydrangeas mingled with delicate white lilies. The arrangement was elegant and deliberate, each stem placed with care. It was so out of place amidst the clutter of her workspace that it took Claire a moment to process what she was seeing. "Whoa!" Lucy was suddenly beside her again, her eyes wide. "Claire, are those for you? Who sent them? A secret admirer, perhaps?" Claire blinked, speechless. I don't know." Lucy grinned, already speculating as she plucked the small card nestled among the blooms and thrust it toward Claire. "Well, open it, let's see." Claire hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the card. The paper was smooth, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. "For the one who lights the way." Beneath the words, a simple sketch, two hands reaching toward each other. Claire's pulse quickened. She stared at the card, feeling her heartbeat thrum in her ears. It was beautiful, simple, yet so deliberate. Her mind immediately flashed to the night before, to Earl Jenkins and his quiet, almost reverent, "Thank you." No, she told herself, it couldn't be. But who else? Lucy leaned over her shoulder, her grin teasing. Ooh, mysterious. Claire, someone's got a thing for you. Stop, Claire said quickly, brushing Lucy off. It's probably nothing. A prank, maybe. But the words felt hollow even as she said them. She tucked the card into her desk drawer and turned back to her computer, trying to focus. The flower's fragrance lingered in the air, tugging at her thoughts. The day wore on in its usual blur of emails, mock-ups, and client calls. Claire tried to lose herself in the work, but every so often her eyes flickered to the bouquet. The hydrangeas were impossibly blue, like the winter sky on a clear morning. She kept replaying the sketch in her mind, two hands, one reaching for the other. By mid-afternoon, Lucy had told half the office about Claire's secret admirer, and Claire found herself fending off playful comments. She forced smiles, brushing it all off as nothing, but deep down her unease grew. Who had sent the flowers? And why? It wasn't until later in the day, when the office had quieted, that Tommy Henderson, the building's janitor, wandered in with his broom and dustpan. Tommy was a wiry man in his 60s with a kind smile and a soft-spoken manner. He paused near Claire's desk, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the bouquet. "Those are beautiful, Miss Claire," Tommy said, his voice gentle. "You must have done something real nice to deserve those." Claire looked up sharply. "Wait, Tommy, did you see who delivered them?" Tommy shook his head, adjusting his cap. "Nope. Didn't see a soul. They were just here when I came by this morning." Claire nodded, forcing a small smile as Tommy shuffled away. The weight in her chest only deepened. As the office began to empty for the night, Claire sat alone at her desk, staring at the flowers. The hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of the janitor's broom were the only sounds left. She pulled the card out from her drawer, running her thumb over the sketch. For the one who lights the way. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to Earl, the way he had looked at her as though committing her face to memory. But how? The man didn't seem like someone who could afford an extravagant bouquet, and yet the message felt personal, purposeful. The mystery gnawed at her as she finally gathered her things. Before turning off her desk lamp, Claire glanced at the flowers one last time. Through the office window, the snow outside glowed faintly in the streetlights, casting a strange stillness over the city. As Claire locked the office door and stepped into the frigid night, she thought she caught a glimpse of someone, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot. She squinted, her breath visible in the cold, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. Claire's small office hummed with its usual energy as she pushed through the glass doors. The sound of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and soft chatter washed over her like white noise. Outside, the snow continued to fall, delicate flakes swirling against the windows, lending an odd calm to the bustling pre-holiday chaos. Claire clutched her thermos of coffee tightly, her fingers still stiff from the cold. The flowers were still there. The massive bouquet of blue hydrangeas and white lilies sat squarely on her desk, vibrant and unwavering, a stark contrast to the scattered paperwork and muted tones of the office. Claire stared at them for a moment longer than she should have before shaking her head and settling into her chair. For the one who lights the way. The note's words drifted back into her thoughts, refusing to be ignored. Who sent them, and why? It made no sense. Claire was not the kind of person who drew attention to herself, let alone secret admirers. "Still there, huh?" Lucy's teasing voice broke through Claire's haze. Claire turned to find her coworker perched on the edge of her desk, a mischievous grin plastered across her face. "Must have been someone who really likes you," Lucy continued, gesturing dramatically to the flowers. "Secret admirer or Christmas miracle?" Claire rolled her eyes, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "You're relentless, Lucy." "Just observant," Lucy countered, hopping off the desk. "I'm telling you, Claire, someone out there thinks you're pretty special." Claire brushed the comment aside with a wave of her hand, but deep down the mystery gnawed at her. There was a weight behind those flowers, something more than a simple gesture, and she couldn't stop herself from wondering what, or who, had put them there. Later that morning, Claire wandered into the break room to refill her coffee. The small space smelled of burnt toast and stale caffeine, its humdrum familiarity oddly comforting. She was stirring creamer into her cup when Tommy Henderson entered, broom in hand, his soft footsteps barely making a sound. "Morning, Miss Claire," he greeted, his voice gentle and steady as always. "Morning, Tommy." Claire offered him a polite smile, though her mind still lingered on the flowers. Tommy moved quietly around the room, tidying up with practiced precision. Claire liked Tommy. He was kind and unobtrusive, a constant but often overlooked presence in the office. Over the years, they'd exchanged small talk about the weather, the holidays, and her occasionally troublesome coffee maker. But today, something in Tommy's demeanor caught her attention, a quiet awareness, as if he could sense the tension in her. "Everything okay, Miss Claire?" Tommy asked, pausing to glance at her. "You seem distracted today." Claire hesitated, surprised by his question. She considered brushing it off, but found herself answering honestly instead. "It's nothing, just those flowers on my desk. I don't know who sent them." Tommy tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowed in thought. "Flowers, huh?" Claire chuckled softly, trying to downplay it. "It's probably a mix-up. I'm not exactly the kind of person who gets mysterious bouquets." Tommy didn't smile. Instead, he looked thoughtful, as though weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Miss Claire, did you help someone recently? Someone down on their luck?" Claire froze, the question striking her like a jolt. "What do you mean?" Tommy set the broom aside and leaned gently against the counter. "My cousin, Earl Jenkins, he told me about someone. Said he met a kind lady on the bus yesterday who paid his fare when he couldn't." Claire's heart skipped. "Earl?" she echoed softly. Tommy nodded. "Earl's been staying with me for a while now. He's had a tough go of it. Used to have his own carpentry business back in Ohio, skilled with his hands, that man. But then a storm came through, tore his workshop apart, his home too. He lost everything." Claire's coffee sat untouched as she listened, her attention fixed on Tommy's words. "He came here hoping for a fresh start," Tommy continued. "Been looking for work ever since. Yesterday he had an interview lined up for a small woodworking shop, a real chance for him to start over. But he almost missed it. Said he didn't have the fare and was about to get kicked off the bus, until someone stepped up and paid for him." Claire's chest tightened. The memory of the older man, his trembling hands, his soft thank you, flashed vividly in her mind. Did he get the job?" she asked quietly. Tommy smiled faintly, his eyes soft with pride. "He did. He wouldn't have made it there without you, Miss Claire. Earl told me about you. Said he'd never forget the lady who saved his day." Claire's breath caught, her thoughts spinning. It was just $5, nothing really. And yet, it wasn't. Tommy seemed to read her disbelief. "You'd be surprised, Miss Claire, how far a small kindness can go. Earl doesn't have much right now, but he's got his heart in his hands. That's where the flowers came from. I think someone else might have sent them, though. Maybe as a thank you." Claire swallowed hard, her eyes stinging as she looked away. The weight of Tommy's words settled over her, heavy and profound. A simple act, an instinctive gesture of compassion, had changed the course of someone's life. Before leaving, Tommy gave her a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes we're the light in someone's dark day, Miss Claire. You just don't always see how far that light shines." Back at her desk, Claire sat staring at the bouquet of flowers, now seeing them with new eyes. The hydrangeas and lilies seemed to glow a little brighter, their presence a quiet reminder of what Tommy had said. "For the one who lights the way." Her heart ached with something she couldn't quite name. Pride, humility, disbelief, all tangled together. She thought of Earl, the man on the bus, and wondered how many times he'd been turned away before someone stopped to help. But then another thought struck her. If Earl couldn't afford the flowers, then who sent them? Claire's gaze lingered on the card as questions swirled in her mind. The mystery was far from solved, and as the day slipped by, the feeling that someone else was involved only grew stronger. As Claire packed up her things to leave, she noticed something. A faint figure through the office window. For the second time that day, she felt as though someone was watching her. But when she looked again, the figure was gone, leaving only the snow swirling against the glass. Claire trudged up the narrow steps to her apartment, her breath forming soft clouds in the icy evening air. Her keys jingled in her hand as she reached her door, her mind still buzzing from the conversation with Tommy. Earl, the flowers, the note, all of it swirled together like snowflakes in a blizzard, too tangled to make sense of yet. She paused mid-step when she noticed something out of place. Tucked under her apartment door was an envelope, elegant and cream-colored, thick to the touch. Claire frowned as she bent down to pick it up. The paper felt expensive, embossed with a logo she didn't recognize. "What is this?" Once inside, Claire dropped her bag by the door and turned on a small lamp in the corner. The room warmed with soft light, casting gentle shadows across her modest living room. It was a small but tidy space. A worn couch, a coffee table cluttered with design sketches and unopened mail, and shelves lined with books she'd read more times than she could count. Practical. Simple. Like her life. Settling onto the couch, Claire carefully slid her finger beneath the envelope's flap and pulled out an invitation. The handwriting was graceful, almost old-fashioned, and the words made her blink in confusion. In gratitude for your light, we invite you to celebrate those who make a difference. This Saturday at the Windsor Charity Gala. Her brow furrowed as she turned the invitation over, searching for more information. Nothing. Just a date, a location, Windsor Hall, the fanciest venue in town, and the cryptic note. This must be a mistake. Claire set the invitation down on the coffee table, staring at it as though it might explain itself. She wasn't the type to receive invitations to charity galas. She wasn't wealthy or important, and she certainly didn't belong in the world of ballrooms, evening gowns, and champagne toasts. Why would someone invite me? She whispered to herself. Claire stood in the kitchen moments later, absently stirring a mug of hot cocoa. The steam curled into the air as she gazed out the window. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the world outside in white. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but her thoughts were anything but. Tommy's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes we're the light in someone's dark day, Miss Claire. You just don't always see how far that light shines. Was this connected to Earl? Had someone from his story sent the flowers? Was this invitation their way of saying thank you? Claire shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. Don't be ridiculous, it's probably just a mistake. Or a prank. But deep down, curiosity pulled at her. She thought back to that day on the bus, to Earl's trembling hands and his soft, broken, "Thank you, ma'am." She had dismissed the act as nothing more than a reflex, a fleeting moment of kindness. But now it didn't feel so fleeting. Now it felt like something bigger. She sank onto the couch again, the invitation still sitting there, daring her to decide. The living room seemed to grow quieter as Claire sat back, her cocoa forgotten. The silence brought memories she hadn't invited, memories of another winter long ago. She was 10 years old. Her father had lost his factory job and her family scraped by on prayers and canned food. The nights were cold, even inside their small, drafty home, and Claire remembered her mother trying to hide her worry as she served smaller and smaller portions at dinner. Then, one evening, a box appeared on their doorstep, full of groceries, blankets, and even a few toys. No note, no name, just kindness, wrapped in cardboard. Claire remembered her father's face when he saw it, relief mixing with pride, humbled by the realization that someone cared enough to help. "People surprise you sometimes, Claire Bear," he'd said, his voice cracking as he unpacked the box. "And when they do, you make sure to remember it." She hadn't forgotten, and now as she stared at the elegant invitation on her coffee table, she realized that maybe, just maybe, someone was surprising her this time. Claire sighed and stood, determination settling into her shoulders. She crossed the room to her tiny bedroom and flipped on the light. The space was sparse. A bed, a dresser, and a mirror propped against the wall. She opened her closet and thumbed through the hangers, pausing when her fingers brushed a long black dress. It was simple, understated, and rarely worn, bought years ago for a work function she hadn't wanted to attend. She pulled it out and held it up against herself, studying her reflection in the mirror. The dress felt like a decision. "What's the harm in going?" she murmured aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I'll finally get some answers." For the first time in a long while, Claire felt something stir in her chest, nerves, anticipation, and an unfamiliar sense that she was stepping toward something bigger than herself. She hung the dress on the bedroom door carefully, smoothing out the fabric as though preparing it for what was to come. Just as Claire turned off the bedroom light, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She frowned, picking it up to find an unknown number flashing across the screen. For a moment, she debated ignoring it, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" A voice crackled softly on the other end, polite, smooth, but with a hint of something else, familiarity. "Miss Thompson?" the voice asked. Claire swallowed. "Yes?" There was a pause. Then with quiet certainty, the voice said, "I believe we'll be seeing you at the gala." The line went dead. Claire stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear as the silence in her apartment deepened. She turned back toward the black dress hanging on her door, the invitation waiting for her on the coffee table. Somewhere deep inside, Claire knew this wasn't just about flowers or a $5 bus fare anymore. Something bigger was waiting. Claire's heels clicked softly against the polished marble floors of the Fairmont Hotel as she approached the ballroom entrance. The grand double doors stood open, allowing the warm golden glow from the chandeliers to spill out into the hallway. Her simple black dress fit well, though Claire still tugged nervously at the sleeves, feeling entirely out of place. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The ballroom was magnificent. Vaulted ceilings glittered with cascading chandeliers, while elegantly set tables adorned with candles and fresh flowers filled the space. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved fluidly among guests, carrying trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. The air buzzed with polite conversation, punctuated by soft piano music from the far corner of the room. Claire's eyes darted across the room, taking in the scene. Women floated past in gowns of deep crimson, emerald, and gold, their laughter light and effortless. Men in tailored tuxedos greeted each other with practiced handshakes. Claire pulled her shoulders back and clutched her small purse tighter, resisting the urge to turn around and leave. "Why am I here?" she thought, her stomach twisting. She scanned the crowd for familiar faces but saw none. "This is a mistake," she told herself. "I don't belong here." The memory of the invitation tugged at her. Celebrate those who make a difference. She reminded herself of Tommy's words earlier that day and pushed through the discomfort. "I'm here to find answers. About Earl. About all of this." Claire moved carefully along the perimeter of the room, skirting the clusters of well-dressed attendees. She felt invisible, which under normal circumstances would have been comforting. Tonight, it only amplified her discomfort. She paused near a tall display of hydrangeas and white lilies, their vibrant blue and soft white blooms echoing the bouquet she'd received. Snippets of conversation drifted toward her. "Silent heroes among us. You'd be surprised how far small acts can go. It doesn't take much to change someone's life." Claire's ears perked at those words, though she pretended to admire the floral arrangement. Were they talking about her? About someone like Earl? The sense of connection, however faint, planted itself deeper. A server stopped beside her. "Champagne, ma'am?" She shook her head quickly. "Oh, no, thank you." "Claire Thompson, I presume?" The voice startled her, and she turned sharply. Standing before her was a tall man, mid-50s, with graying hair neatly combed back. He wore an impeccable tuxedo that somehow managed to look both formal and approachable. A warm smile softened the lines on his face, and his sharp, observant eyes met hers. "I'm Mr. Anderson," he continued, extending his hand. "Welcome to the gala. I'm so glad you made it." Claire blinked, stunned that he knew her name. She shook his hand reflexively. How do you know who I am?" Mr. Anderson's smile grew, though it held a hint of mystery. "Why don't we talk somewhere quieter? Follow me." Claire hesitated, but her curiosity outweighed her nerves. She followed him toward a quieter corner near a large window overlooking the snowy cityscape below. Once they were seated, Mr. Anderson leaned forward slightly, his expression kind but deliberate. "Claire," he began, "you're here tonight because of what you did on the bus the other day." Her breath caught. I was there," he explained, holding up a hand gently. "I watched as you stepped forward without hesitation and paid for that man's fare. It may have felt small to you, but to someone watching, someone like me, it was a reminder of something bigger." Claire's brows furrowed. "It was just $5, she said softly. "Anyone would have done it." Mr. Anderson shook his head, his gaze steady. "That's where you're wrong. Not everyone would. I spend my life funding initiatives to help people, those who are often overlooked. And I've learned that it's the smallest gestures that create the largest ripples. Your kindness reminded me of that." Claire stared at him, stunned. "So, you sent the flowers? The invitation?" Mr. Anderson smiled faintly. "The invitation, yes. The flowers. I suspect they're part of another ripple." He leaned back, his voice softening. "Earl Jenkins. He was on his way to an interview that day, you know. That interview could change his life. You didn't just give him bus fare, Claire. You gave him hope." The words hung in the air. Claire's heart swelled as she processed them, a warmth spreading through her chest. She thought back to Earl's trembling hands, the weight of his gratitude in his cracked voice. She'd brushed it off as nothing, but it wasn't nothing. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me?" Mr. Anderson's gaze held hers. "Because people like you matter. You light the way, even when you don't realize it." Claire felt her throat tighten. For years she'd buried herself in routine, believing her life had little impact. Now, here was someone telling her otherwise, that her actions, no matter how small, carried weight. The sound of clinking glasses drew Claire's attention back to the room. Guests gathered around for a toast, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Claire turned back to Mr. Anderson, feeling strangely grounded yet untethered, like she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. "Stay and enjoy the evening," Mr. Anderson said, rising to his feet. "You deserve to be part of this celebration." Claire nodded, though words still failed her. As Mr. Anderson walked back into the crowd, she found herself standing alone by the window. She watched the snow falling steadily outside, her reflection faint against the glass. Then she saw him. A familiar figure entered the ballroom, standing near the doorway and nervously adjusting his borrowed suit jacket. Claire's breath hitched. It was Earl Jenkins. Her eyes widened as she watched him scan the room, clearly unsure of where to go. The sight of him, so out of place, so different from the polished crowd, sent her pulse racing. Why is he here? Claire turned instinctively, her heart pounding. Questions flooded her mind, but one thing was certain. The evening wasn't over yet. Claire stood near a table decorated with white lilies and golden name cards, sipping water from a glass to calm her nerves. The ballroom's brilliance still overwhelmed her, but the steady murmur of conversations and clinking of glasses had become a low hum in the background. Then, she saw him. Across the room, Earl Jenkins stood near the doorway, nervously tugging at the cuff of his borrowed suit jacket. The transformation was startling. His clothes, though not expensive, were crisp and clean, and his polished shoes reflected the glow of the chandelier above. His posture still carried a hint of uncertainty, as though he wasn't quite convinced he belonged. Claire's heart warmed. He was here. Earl spotted her. Their eyes met and a small, shy smile crept across his face. Slowly, he made his way through the room toward her, glancing around as if afraid someone might ask him to leave. When he finally reached her, he cleared his throat and dipped his head in greeting. "Miss Claire," he said softly, his voice steady but humble. "I hoped I'd find you here." Claire smiled warmly. "Earl, it's good to see you. I wasn't expecting—" She hesitated, glancing at his suit. "You clean up nicely." Earl chuckled lightly, shifting his weight. "Mr. Anderson invited me, said I had every right to be here. Though, I'll admit, I still feel like I'm sneaking into someone else's party." Claire shook her head. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." Earl nodded, swallowing hard before continuing. "I wanted to thank you. Properly this time. I don't know if you realize what you did for me on that bus." "It was nothing," Claire said quickly, though her words felt small as soon as they left her lips. Earl shook his head firmly. "No, Miss Claire, it wasn't nothing. That $5, it gave me dignity. When I stepped on that bus, I felt invisible, like no one cared whether I made it to where I was going or not. But you saw me. That act," he paused, his voice catching slightly, "it gave me hope to keep trying. And I did." Claire blinked back sudden tears. She didn't know how to respond. Earl continued. "I got the job. That interview I was headed to. I got it. I'm working at a small woodworking shop now. It's honest work and I'm good at it. I'm saving up too. My daughter and my grandson. They're going to move here soon so we can start fresh." Claire smiled, genuinely moved. "I'm so happy for you, Earl. You deserve this." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a soft cloth. "I wanted to give you something I made with my own hands." Earl unwrapped the cloth carefully to reveal a small wooden carving. Claire gasped softly as she took it in. Two hands clasped together, carved with such precision and care that she could see the fine lines and grooves of each finger. "It's not much," Earl said, his voice quiet but proud. "But it's my way of saying thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Claire held the carving gently, her thumb brushing over its smooth surface. "It's beautiful, Earl. Thank you." The sound of a microphone tapping drew their attention. Mr. Anderson had taken the stage, and the room gradually fell silent. Claire and Earl turned toward the front as Mr. Anderson's warm, confident voice filled the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Tonight we gather to celebrate generosity, compassion, and the ripple effect of kindness. It's easy to overlook the small moments, the ones we think don't matter. But sometimes, the smallest actions create the largest waves." Claire's heart skipped a beat as Mr. Anderson's eyes scanned the room briefly, resting on her for just a moment. "Let me share a story," he continued. "A few days ago, I witnessed a simple act, someone stepping forward to help another person in need. It was quiet, unassuming, and selfless. That small act didn't just change one life. It inspired hope, reminded us of our shared humanity, and touched more people than that person could ever realize." The room erupted into warm applause, though no names were mentioned. Claire's cheeks flushed as a quiet, inexplicable pride bloomed within her. For years, she'd felt invisible, like her life was passing by unnoticed. Now she realized that her actions, no matter how small, mattered. Earl turned to her with a soft smile. "That's you, Miss Claire. He's talking about you." Claire looked down at the wooden carving in her hand, feeling its weight, its meaning. "It's about all of us, Earl," she whispered. "You're part of this too." As the evening drew on, Claire and Earl found a quiet corner to talk. Earl shared stories about his new job, how he loved the smell of wood and the satisfaction of creating something with his hands. He spoke of his daughter and grandson with hope in his voice, his eyes shining with dreams of their future together. "You never know who's watching or how far kindness can go," Earl said softly. "You gave me hope, and I'm going to keep passing it on." Claire smiled, her heart full. "That's how it works, isn't it? One small act leads to another." Earl nodded, like a ripple in a pond. As the gala began to wind down, Claire stood near the exit, preparing to leave. She glanced back at the room, the chandeliers, the laughter, the people who seemed worlds away from her ordinary life. Mr. Anderson appeared beside her, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "Claire," he said with a smile, "I meant what I said earlier. This could be just the beginning. There's so much more you can do." Claire hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. She'd spent so much of her life blending into the background, but now... "Think about it," Mr. Anderson added. "Sometimes life gives us opportunities to step into something bigger than ourselves." Claire looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I will." As she turned to leave, she clutched the small wooden carving in her hand, its meaning clear, a reminder of the ripple effect she'd set in motion. Claire woke up to the faint glow of winter light spilling through the blinds. Snow was still falling softly outside, blanketing the streets and rooftops in pristine white. For a few quiet moments she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the previous evening replayed in her mind. Earl's gratitude, the carving he had given her, and Mr. Anderson's offer. Her gaze drifted toward her nightstand. The small wooden sculpture of two clasped hands rested there, a silent reminder of the ripple she had unknowingly set in motion. Claire reached for it, running her thumb along its smooth surface. "Who am I to make a difference?" she whispered to herself. "I'm just an ordinary person." The thought lingered like a dark cloud, fed by insecurities she had carried for years. Claire had always seen herself as someone who kept her head down, working hard, paying her bills, and living quietly. Nothing more. The idea of stepping into something larger terrified her. At work later that morning, the hum of activity filled the small office. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and coworkers buzzed about deadlines. Claire sat at her desk, staring blankly at her screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but her mind wandered back to the gala, the shimmering chandeliers, Mr. Anderson's words, and Earl's heartfelt gratitude. Earth to Claire. Claire looked up to see Lucy Myers leaning against her desk, holding a donut in one hand and her coffee in the other. Lucy's grin was wide and teasing. "You've been in another world since yesterday. Spill it, Claire. What happened at that fancy gala?" Claire sighed, half smiling. "It's nothing." Lucy raised an eyebrow. "Nothing? You vanished for the evening, show up this morning looking all thoughtful and mysterious, and now you're pretending like nothing happened. Come on." Claire hesitated, then relented. "I met someone who offered me a chance to get involved in his charity work. He said I could make a difference." Lucy's eyes widened. "That's incredible. What did you say?" "I didn't say anything," Claire admitted, her voice soft. "I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I'm not exactly the type to inspire people." Lucy shook her head, her voice turning firm but kind. Claire, look at me. You always think you don't matter, but look what one small moment did. That guy, Earl, he got a job because of you. You set something in motion, and now someone's giving you a chance to keep going. Claire looked down, her hands clasped in her lap. I'm just not sure I'm the right person for this. Lucy leaned closer, smiling gently. You're more capable than you give yourself credit for. And if you say yes, you won't be alone. People will help you figure it out. Don't let doubt make this decision for you. Claire said nothing, but Lucy's words lingered long after their conversation ended. That evening, Claire sat alone in her small apartment, the quiet hum of the radiator filling the space. She placed the wooden carving Earl had given her next to the bouquet of flowers, now wilting but still beautiful in the dim light. She stared at them, both symbols of kindness and connection. Small gestures, yet they carried so much weight. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood. She could still see her father, his hands rough and calloused from years of labor, sitting her down one cold winter night. Their family had been struggling back then. Her father had lost his job, and the pantry had been nearly empty. But one day, an anonymous box of groceries had appeared on their doorstep. It's not about how much you have, Claire, he had told her, his voice low but steady. It's what you do with what you're given. Always remember that. Claire wiped at her eyes, the memory pulling at her heart. That simple act of generosity had stayed with her all these years, even as life's burdens buried it beneath the surface. Taking a deep breath, Claire grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The night air was crisp, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots as she walked through the neighborhood. Lights from nearby houses glowed warmly, families laughing inside as they decorated for the holidays. Children ran through the snow, their joyous squeals carrying through the quiet streets. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt like she was part of something larger than herself. Her quiet life had always felt disconnected, but the events of the past few days had started to change that. She realized Mr. Anderson was right. Small actions mattered. Her simple decision on the bus had led to something bigger than she could have imagined. Maybe this opportunity was a way to pay forward the kindness she'd received throughout her life. When Claire returned to her apartment, she noticed something unusual. An envelope rested on her doorstep, its cream-colored surface nearly blending in with the snow. Frowning, she picked it up and carried it inside. The handwriting was elegant and familiar. She opened the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten note from Mr. Anderson. The world needs more lights like yours. Join us at the community center tomorrow at 10 a.m. Claire stared at the note, her heartbeat quickening. The decision lingered in the air, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. She set the note down on her table and looked back at the wooden carving and the flowers. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what might happen if she said yes. Claire stood outside the Sunset Hills Community Center, her breath visible in the icy morning air. The building in front of her wasn't anything fancy: peeling paint, faded posters taped to the windows, and a crooked sign hanging just above the entrance. But through the frosted glass doors, Claire could see movement, volunteers rushing around, laughter carrying faintly into the cold air, and a warmth that somehow radiated outward. For a moment, Claire hesitated, gripping the handle of her worn-out purse. She could feel her heart thumping in her chest. What am I even doing here? She thought. This wasn't her world. She was just a graphic designer from a small office, not someone who belonged in the center of a changemaker's hub. Yet here she was, because of a simple $5 gesture that somehow set her life on a different path. Taking a deep breath, Claire pushed open the door. Inside, the community center buzzed with organized chaos. Volunteers ranging from teenagers to retirees moved with purpose, sorting boxes, decorating tables with holiday wreaths, and chatting warmly as they worked. The smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries drifted through the air, mingling with the faint scent of disinfectant. Claire Thompson, I presume? The voice came from a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a sturdy presence. She wore an oversized cardigan, her gray hair pinned neatly back. A small name tag on her sweater read Judith Harris, Director. Claire nodded, offering an awkward smile. Yes, that's me. Mrs. Harris beamed and reached out to shake Claire's hand. I'm Judith. Mr. Anderson told me to expect you. We're thrilled you're here. Anyone who believes in kindness is welcome under this roof. Judith's words were warm but left Claire momentarily speechless. I don't know how much help I'll be, but I'm here, she said, her voice quiet. You're already helping, Claire. Showing up is half the battle, Judith replied, leading Claire deeper into the bustling main room. Claire followed Judith and Mr. Anderson, who had just appeared with his usual calm and confident demeanor. As they walked, they passed families filling baskets with food donations, children coloring on makeshift tables for an after-school art project, and elderly volunteers chatting as they packed winter care kits. This place holds the heart of the community, Mr. Anderson said, gesturing around. It's not perfect, but it's a lifeline for so many people. Judith chimed in. We do what we can with what we've got, but as you can see, the need keeps growing, and we're stretched thin. Her tone remained positive, but Claire could hear the strain beneath her words. The more Claire saw, the clearer the picture became. This community center wasn't just a building, it was a refuge. After the tour, Mr. Anderson turned to Claire with his familiar, encouraging smile. Let's put you to work. Judith handed Claire a pair of gloves and gestured toward a corner where piles of winter clothes, coats, scarves, and gloves sat waiting to be sorted. Claire hesitated briefly but then rolled up her sleeves. The task was simple. Organize the clothes by size and set aside worn-out items. But Claire couldn't shake the awkwardness of feeling out of place. She worked in silence, listening to the volunteers around her talk and laugh as they worked. First time here? The voice came from an older woman next to her, wearing a red knit hat and thick glasses. Claire nodded. Yeah, I'm still figuring it all out. The woman chuckled. That's how it starts for all of us. But you'll see, it's hard to leave once you realize the difference this place makes. As they sorted, a young mother with 2 small children approached. Excuse me, she said softly. Are these for families who need them? Judith stepped over and nodded warmly. Take whatever your family needs to stay warm this winter. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she picked up a small red coat for her youngest. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to us. Claire's heart clenched as she watched the woman and her children walk away. She thought about her parents and their quiet sacrifices, and for the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a mix of pride, purpose, and gratitude. By the end of the day, Claire's hands were stiff, her back ached, and she was exhausted. But she felt something else too, fulfilled. You survived your first day, Judith teased as Claire peeled off her gloves. You did good, Claire. People just need to know someone cares, and today, you showed up. Claire smiled faintly, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. Thank you for letting me help. As she walked to her car, Mr. Anderson fell into step beside her. The evening sky had turned dusky purple, and the snowflakes drifted lazily to the ground. You did well today, he said quietly. You see now what I meant, don't you? The world changes one small act at a time. Claire looked at him, her voice soft but certain. I think I'm starting to. He paused, his hands in his coat pockets, before adding, This is just the beginning, Claire. I have something special planned for you next week. You'll want to be ready. Claire blinked, surprised. What do you mean? You'll see, Mr. Anderson said, a hint of mischief in his smile. Sometimes the next step finds us when we least expect it. As Claire drove home that night, her phone buzzed with a message. Glancing down at the screen, she saw it was from Mr. Anderson. Don't lose that light, Claire. See you next week. Claire stared at the message, her curiosity and nerves growing. For the first time in years, she felt like something bigger was waiting for her. Something she hadn't seen coming, but couldn't turn away from now. Claire stood at the entrance of the Sunset Hills Community Center, staring at the bustling scene through the frosted glass doors. A week had passed since her first visit, yet her palms still felt clammy with nerves. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Claire, you're back! Mrs. Harris's voice rang out, warm as always. She moved quickly toward Claire, her cardigan sleeves pushed up and a clipboard in hand. I knew we could count on you. Claire offered a small smile. I'm here to help, but I'm not sure how much use I'll be. Nonsense, Mrs. Harris replied, placing a hand on Claire's shoulder. Actually, I've got just the task for you, one I know you're more than capable of. Claire's brows knit together. Task? Mrs. Harris's smile softened as she explained. We're organizing a holiday food drive for families in need. I want you to help lead it. The words hit Claire like a gust of cold wind. She opened her mouth to protest, but faltered under Mrs. Harris's expectant gaze. Me? I'm not a leader, Mrs. Harris. I wouldn't even know where to start. No one starts out knowing how, Claire, Mrs. Harris said gently. We learn as we go. Besides, you won't be doing this alone. Trust yourself, because I already do. The next few hours blurred into motion. Claire found herself surrounded by volunteers eager to make a difference, each of them bringing unique skills and perspectives. Tommy Henderson arrived with his calm presence, rolling up his sleeves with a simple nod toward Claire. Figured you'd need an extra pair of hands, he said, grinning. Earl Jenkins showed up next, lugging a toolbox. Thought I could build some shelves in the back for the donations, he offered. They'll hold better than those flimsy folding tables. And then, to Claire's surprise, Lucy appeared. Her cheerful voice carried across the room as she entered, a box of canned goods in her arms. You didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you? Weekends are for heroes now. For the first time that day, Claire felt the edges of her doubts soften. Surrounded by people so willing to help, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could pull this off. Days passed in a blur of effort and organization. Claire coordinated donation bins, created schedules, and even called local businesses to ask for contributions. Small victories began to pile up. A family arrived with 2 bags of groceries. A local bakery donated fresh bread. Volunteers worked tirelessly to sort and pack food boxes. But as the food drive gained momentum, so did Claire's sense of responsibility. The center overflowed with people in need, more than Claire had expected. Watching mothers with young children and elderly couples quietly waiting their turn, her stomach twisted with a familiar sense of helplessness. During a short break, she confided in Mrs. Harris, her voice low and strained. There's not enough. We won't be able to help everyone. Mrs. Harris's expression was a mix of compassion and sadness. You're right, Claire, we don't have enough. It breaks my heart every time we have to say no. But the little we can give still makes a difference to someone. Claire nodded, her throat tight. The weight of the growing need pressed heavily on her shoulders. What if this isn't enough? What if I'm not enough? She thought. The pressure mounted later that day when Mark Reynolds, a reporter from the local paper, arrived. He was a sharp man with a neatly trimmed beard and a probing gaze. I hear you're running the food drive, he said, introducing himself to Claire. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Claire hesitated but nodded, unsure how to handle the attention. Mark's questions were polite yet persistent, focusing on the center's mission and the growing need in the community. When he turned the spotlight on her, Claire stumbled over her words. I'm just helping where I can. It's nothing special, she said quietly. Mark studied her for a moment. It doesn't look like nothing to me. It seems like you're making quite the difference. Claire's cheeks flushed and she ducked her head. I'm just one of many people helping out. Mark nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more. He scribbled a note in his pad and left shortly after, but his presence left Claire feeling unsettled. That evening, the center's largest donor called to announce they were pulling their funding for the year. The news landed like a punch to the gut. Volunteers whispered among themselves, and the mood in the center dimmed. Claire sat on the steps outside, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Mr. Anderson found her there, his calm presence a quiet balm against the chaos. Hard day? He asked. Claire looked up, her voice wavering. It feels like we're fighting a losing battle. What's the point if it's never enough? Mr. Anderson's gaze softened. Kindness isn't easy, Claire. It's not always rewarded the way we think it should be, but you have to keep going. Because to the people you're helping, it's everything. Claire sighed, the weight of the day still heavy on her chest. I just don't want to let them down. You won't, Mr. Anderson said simply. You're already making a difference. You just can't always see it yet. As Claire walked back to her car, the night had turned still and cold. Her footsteps crunched softly against the snow, and her breath hung like clouds in the air. It was then she saw them, a line of families forming outside the community center, bundled in coats and scarves, waiting patiently for their chance at a box of food. Claire stopped and stared, her heart sinking. Their faces, hopeful, weary, and grateful all at once, were etched into her mind. We have to make this work, she thought fiercely, no matter what. With renewed determination, Claire climbed into her car, already planning her next move. Claire sat at her kitchen table late into the night, her living room dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. Sheets of paper, scribbled with plans and notes, were scattered across the surface. Her mind buzzed with determination, the image of families standing outside the community center still etched into her thoughts. We might not be able to save everyone, she whispered to herself, but we can make a difference for them. As the clock crept past midnight, Claire leaned back in her chair and exhaled. She had a plan, and come morning, she would put it into action. The following day, Claire stood at the center of the community room, facing the tired but hopeful eyes of the volunteers. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steady as she spoke. "I know we've hit a wall," she began, "but I refuse to believe we're out of options. There are families counting on us, children, parents, grandparents. If we work together, we can make sure no one here goes hungry this Christmas." The room fell silent as Claire continued. "We'll knock on doors, call businesses, whatever it takes to fill this room with food and hope." She looked around at their faces. "I can't do this alone, but if we stand together, I know we can do something incredible." A quiet ripple spread through the room. Then Tommy Henderson spoke up, his voice warm and reassuring. "You heard the lady. Let's get to work." The volunteers broke into action, energized by Claire's words. Earl Jenkins offered to build additional shelving to store donations. Lucy Myers grabbed her coat, already planning which businesses to visit first. Even Mrs. Harris, clipboard in hand, offered a nod of pride as she rallied volunteers to join Claire's efforts. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Claire, Lucy, and Earl visited every grocery store, bakery, and hardware shop in town. Some owners shook their heads apologetically, unable to give, while others surprised them with unexpected generosity. At the local bakery, the owner, a soft-spoken woman with flour-dusted hands, listened carefully before disappearing into the kitchen. When she returned, she held out several loaves of fresh bread. "It's not much," she said, "but it's what I can give." At a hardware store, the gruff manager raised an eyebrow at Claire's request. "Storage bins for a food drive?" He scratched his chin, considering. Finally, he grumbled, "Fine, I'll throw in 20 bins. Just don't make me regret it." Claire thanked him with genuine gratitude, her heart swelling as she watched her small team work tirelessly. Each act of generosity, no matter how big or small, felt like a victory. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds grew increasingly curious about Claire's story. Armed with his notebook and pen, he tracked down Earl Jenkins, who shared the story of the bus ride and the woman who had unknowingly changed his life. "She didn't have to help," Earl said quietly, his calloused hands clasped in front of him. "But she did. That $5 got me to my interview. It got me here working again and feeling like I matter." Mark's mind spun as he pieced the details together. This wasn't just a story about a food drive. This was about how one small act of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could predict. As he sat in his car later that evening, he drafted a headline in his notebook. "The Ripple Effect of Kindness, How One Act Changed a Community." By the fourth day, donations began trickling into the community center. Families arrived carrying bags of canned goods. A local farmer delivered crates of fresh vegetables. An anonymous donor left an envelope with a crisp $100 bill, signed only with the words, "For those who need it most." Claire watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and awe. Volunteers moved like a well-oiled machine, sorting and stacking food, filling boxes, and preparing for the drive's final day. Tommy gave her a thumbs up as he carried another crate into the back. "You're doing good here, Claire," he said. But Claire shook her head. "We're doing good here." That evening, as the sun dipped below the snow-covered rooftops, Mr. Anderson arrived at the community center. He carried a small, polished briefcase and wore his usual calm expression as he approached Claire. "You've built something remarkable here," he said, glancing at the neatly organized shelves and bustling volunteers. "It's proof of what people can accomplish when they come together." Claire brushed a strand of hair from her face, her cheeks pink with the cold. "It's not just me, everyone's worked so hard." Mr. Anderson smiled knowingly and opened his briefcase. Inside was a document stamped with the logo of his foundation. "We've been watching what you've done, Claire. The foundation has decided to match every donation you've collected so far." Claire blinked, her breath catching. "Wait, what?" "It's our way of making sure your hard work goes even further," he said. Cheers erupted across the room as the news spread. Volunteers hugged one another, and a few people clapped Claire on the back. She felt a lump rise in her throat, not from pride, but from the overwhelming realization that kindness was contagious. Her small gesture on the bus had sparked something far bigger than herself. As the evening quieted, Claire sat on the edge of a folding chair, exhausted but content. Mark Reynolds approached her, holding a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her with a small smile. "You might want to read this," he said. "It's a draft of my next article. People need to hear what you've done." Claire hesitated, staring at the paper in her hands. I don't know. This isn't about me." "That's where you're wrong," Mark replied gently. "This is about how one person can make a difference, and how others follow." Claire looked up at him, torn between humility and the weight of his words. She glanced at the volunteers still working tirelessly around her, and thought about the families who would have food on their tables this Christmas. Maybe it was time for others to hear their story. Claire awoke to the persistent buzz of her phone vibrating against her nightstand. Groggily, she reached over and squinted at the bright screen. Texts, notifications, and missed calls flooded her inbox. Confused, she rubbed her eyes and sat up. Then she saw it. Her name was plastered across the front page of the Sunset Hills Gazette. The ripple effect of kindness, how one act changed a community. The article, written by Mark Reynolds, featured a photograph of the bustling food drive alongside a headline that felt both surreal and unsettling. Claire skimmed the first few lines, her pulse quickening. It all began with a $5 act of kindness. Claire Thompson, an unassuming graphic designer, didn't realize that her simple decision to pay for a stranger's bus fare would ripple outward, transforming not just one life, but an entire community. Claire dropped her phone into her lap and sighed. Oh no. When Claire arrived at the community center later that morning, the atmosphere was different, warmer, more charged. The usual chatter of volunteers was replaced by murmurs and lingering smiles. As soon as she stepped through the door, the room erupted into quiet applause. A blush crept up her face. "What's going on?" Mrs. Harris approached her, beaming. "You've seen the article, haven't you?" Claire opened her mouth to protest, but a single father interrupted, extending his hand. His face, lined with exhaustion, was softened by a grateful smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "Your kindness reminded me there's still hope out there." Claire shook his hand awkwardly. A young girl followed him, shyly holding out a handmade card. Claire took it and read the words scrawled in bright crayon. "Thank you for helping people like us." Her chest tightened. She looked at the child's hopeful face, then at the small group of volunteers clapping and smiling toward her. For a moment she felt proud, but it was short-lived, replaced quickly by discomfort. That afternoon, Claire found herself in Mr. Anderson's office, her hands clutching the card like a lifeline. "I didn't ask for this," she said, exasperated. "I didn't do this for recognition. I just did what felt right." Mr. Anderson studied her carefully before speaking, his voice calm and measured. "Sometimes, Claire, your story isn't just yours anymore. It becomes a light for others who need to see what's possible." Claire looked down, her mind racing. "But I'm not special. I just helped one person. That's all." "That's where you're wrong," Mr. Anderson replied softly. "Most people walk past moments of opportunity to help without ever stopping. You chose to see someone, and that matters more than you realize." That evening, Claire sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through the online version of Mark's article. Comments poured in beneath the story. "What a heartwarming story. We need more people like Claire. Proof that small acts can change lives. Truly inspiring. But not all were kind. Why does she get all the praise? People do good things every day. Some of us don't have time to play hero. Must be nice." Claire stared at the screen, the negativity gnawing at her confidence. The doubts she had buried for days bubbled back to the surface. Maybe they're right, she thought. Maybe this is all a fluke. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Earl. At the small diner on Main Street, Claire stirred her coffee aimlessly while Earl sipped his tea, his rough hands wrapped around the warm mug. Earl had a calmness about him now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "You didn't just change my life, Claire," he said, his voice steady. "You reminded me I wasn't alone. Do you know how powerful that is?" Claire looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "It was just $5, Earl. It wasn't—" "It was everything to me," he cut in gently. "You don't get to decide how much your kindness matters. That's for the people you help to decide." Claire blinked back tears, his words sinking in. "Don't let anyone take that away from you," Earl added firmly. "Not the critics, not the naysayers, no one." For the first time in days, Claire felt a sense of clarity. Earl's gratitude wasn't about her, it was about what her actions had inspired. As Claire stepped out of the diner, her breath misting in the cold night air, she froze. A small news van was parked near the curb, its headlights illuminating the snowy street. Mark Reynolds stepped out, holding a microphone and flanked by a camera crew. He approached her with an apologetic smile. "Claire, wait. Don't panic. I promise this isn't as bad as it looks." "What's going on?" she asked warily. Mark lowered his voice, his tone sincere. "The local station loved your story. They want to feature you on tonight's broadcast. I know this isn't easy for you, but your story has already inspired so many people. This could help even more." Claire stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. The spotlight loomed larger now, threatening to pull her further into a world she hadn't asked for. She looked at Mark, at the camera crew waiting nearby, and then up at the twinkling Christmas lights strung along the lampposts. A single question swirled in her mind. Am I ready for this? Claire stared at the soft glow of her phone screen, her inbox still flooded with messages about Mark Reynolds' article. Words of praise, gratitude, and shared stories swirled together, but she couldn't stop thinking about the camera crew. The attention felt heavy, like an ill-fitting coat she couldn't shrug off. That night, she called Lucy. "I don't think I can do it," Claire admitted, pacing her living room. "I'm no one special. What am I even going to say?" Lucy, never one to let Claire hide, responded with gentle firmness. "Claire, it's not about you, it's about the message. What if someone out there needs to hear this? What if it reminds them to care a little more?" The question hung in the air like frost on a window pane. Claire sighed and sank onto the couch. "What if I mess up?" Lucy's voice softened. "You won't. You'll speak from your heart, just like you always do." The next morning, Claire found herself in the parking lot of the local news station, her palms damp despite the winter chill. The building loomed ahead, sleek and polished, a stark contrast to the warm chaos of the community center. Inside the studio, everything felt surreal. Bright lights, sleek cameras, and staff buzzing quietly like bees around a hive. Claire sat in a chair under the glare of a spotlight, trying to steady her breathing. The anchor, a poised woman with a crisp blazer and a soothing voice, leaned forward with an encouraging smile. "Don't worry, Claire," she said softly. "This is just a conversation. Take your time." The cameras rolled. The interview began with the basics: her name, what she did for a living, and the story behind her simple decision on the bus. Claire shifted in her seat as the anchor asked, "What made you step in to help that man that day?" Claire swallowed hard, then answered truthfully, "I saw someone struggling, and it felt wrong to stay silent. I didn't think about it. It was instinct. I guess I just did what anyone would do." The anchor smiled. "And yet, not everyone does. Did you ever imagine it would lead to all of this?" Claire paused. "No. I thought it was just a small thing, something that would fade away. But what I've learned is that kindness, it has a way of spreading. It connects us, even when we don't see it right away." As she spoke, footage rolled in the background. Volunteers packing boxes at the community center, Earl helping a child zip up a donated coat, families smiling as they collected meals. The anchor closed the segment with quiet reverence. In a world that sometimes feels divided, Claire's story reminds us that small acts can create powerful ripples. The community center continues to collect donations for families in need this holiday season. Claire let out a slow breath as the cameras dimmed. "You did great," the anchor assured her. Claire smiled faintly, unsure if she believed it, but grateful that the focus had stayed on the center, not on her. That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table scrolling through her phone. The interview had aired just hours earlier, but the response was already overwhelming. Messages poured in. "Your story inspired me to donate to my local food bank. Thank you for reminding us that kindness matters. It's the little things that make the world better. I needed to hear this." Claire set her phone down, her throat tight. These weren't just words. They were proof. Proof that the ripple effect was real. The next morning at the community center, the difference was palpable. Volunteers bustled with renewed energy, sorting through a flood of new donations. Bags of food lined the hallways, and strangers dropped by to offer checks or ask how they could help. Claire watched in quiet awe as Earl guided a boy through racks of coats, helping him find one that fit. Across the room, Lucy helped a group of seniors wrap donated toys for local kids. Mrs. Harris approached, her kind eyes twinkling. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Claire nodded. "I didn't think..." She trailed off, unsure how to put it into words. Mrs. Harris finished for her. That one small act could do all this? Claire smiled. Yeah. Mrs. Harris gestured to the room, where laughter and warmth filled every corner. This is what happens when people believe in something bigger than themselves, and it started with you. Claire opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Harris raised a hand. It's not about taking credit, Claire. It's about showing people that anyone can make a difference. As the food drive neared its final stages, Claire sat in the corner of the room, letting the moment wash over her. Her doubts hadn't disappeared entirely, but seeing the smiling faces and shared purpose, she couldn't deny the truth. This mattered. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Harris, who sat down beside her, holding an envelope. A donor reached out after seeing your story, she said softly, handing it over. They want to meet you personally, and they're talking about saving the center. Claire's eyes widened as she stared at the envelope, her pulse quickening. Saving the center? What do you mean? Mrs. Harris smiled. You'll find out soon enough. Claire turned the envelope over in her hands, her mind racing. The thought of meeting a major donor, someone with the power to change everything, felt overwhelming. But beneath the nerves, there was something else. Hope. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the community center, casting a golden glow on the organized chaos inside. Volunteers bustled around, sorting food donations into boxes and chatting warmly with families who came through the doors. Despite the hum of activity, Claire couldn't shake the unease sitting heavy in her chest. She stood at a folding table, her hands absent-mindedly stacking canned goods when Mrs. Harris approached, holding a cream-colored envelope. Claire, Mrs. Harris said gently, this came for you. Claire wiped her hands on her jeans before taking the envelope. It felt heavy, its embossed logo exuding importance. She hesitated, then tore it open. Inside was an invitation written in flawless handwriting. David Callahan, president of Callahan Philanthropic Trust, requests your presence to discuss the future of Sunset Hills Community Center. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Callahan? She murmured. She'd heard the name before, everyone in town had. David Callahan was a local philanthropist whose fortune was matched only by his influence. Mrs. Harris offered a reassuring smile. This could change everything for the center, Claire. Trust yourself, you've come this far. Claire nodded faintly, but doubt lingered. Why would someone like David Callahan care about her or the center? That afternoon, Claire found herself stepping through the glass doors of Callahan's downtown office building. The lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and modern art that looked far too expensive to understand. It was a stark contrast to the worn floors and mismatched chairs of the community center. An assistant guided her into an office with sweeping windows that framed the town like a painting. Behind a gleaming desk stood David Callahan. He was a tall man with silver-streaked hair and sharp features, his tailored suit impeccable. He extended a hand with a practiced smile. Claire Thompson, he said warmly, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Claire shook his hand, her fingers dwarfed by his firm grip. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Callahan. Please, call me David, he replied, motioning for her to sit across from him at a sleek conference table. I've been following your story. What you've done with the food drive and the center is nothing short of remarkable. Claire shifted uncomfortably. I'm just doing what I can. It's really the community coming together. David studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. That's what makes you extraordinary, Claire. People need leaders who don't seek attention but inspire action. You have that rare quality. Claire blinked, unsure how to respond. David leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge of precision. I'll get straight to the point. I want to help. The Callahan Trust can fund the center for the next 2 years, cover repairs, expand your programs, and ensure no family goes without food this season. Relief swelled in Claire's chest. That's incredible, she whispered. But, David continued, holding up a finger, I have a condition. The word hung in the air like a stone dropped in water. Claire frowned. A condition? David's smile softened, but his tone remained firm. I'd like to rename the center after my late wife, Margaret Callahan. She dedicated her life to philanthropy, and I think this would honor her legacy. Claire stared at him, her mind scrambling to process his words. Rename the center. Yes, David said smoothly. And I'd like to make some operational adjustments, streamline programs, bring in new leadership to ensure everything runs efficiently. Claire's stomach dropped. Efficiently? she repeated. David leaned back, folding his hands. Claire, the center does wonderful work, but it has potential for so much more. My team would help elevate its impact, make it something truly exceptional. Claire's voice was quiet but firm. The center isn't just a building. It's a home for people who have nowhere else to go. It's built on trust, not efficiency. David's smile faltered slightly, though his tone remained calm. Sometimes progress requires compromise. I'm offering you a chance to make a bigger impact. Without my help, the center might not survive long term. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She stood abruptly, clutching her bag. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Callahan, but I need time to think about this. David's eyes narrowed, just a fraction. Of course, Claire, but I don't wait long. My assistant will follow up tomorrow. Back at the community center, Claire stood in the doorway, watching volunteers unload boxes of donations. Her mind buzzed with Callahan's words. Earl Jenkins spotted her and approached, his usual easy smile in place. You look like you've seen a ghost, Claire. What's up? Claire sighed, leaning against the wall. I met with a donor today. He offered to fund the center, but there's a catch. Earl's brow furrowed. What kind of catch? He wants to rename the center and change the way it's run. It wouldn't be the same. Earl was quiet for a moment, then he said softly, You know what makes this place special, Claire? It's not the name on the door, it's the people inside. Claire looked at him, surprised by his wisdom. Earl continued, his voice steady. Do what feels right. If it's not about the people anymore, it's not worth it. That evening, Claire sat on her couch with the envelope Callahan had given her, turning it over in her hands. The center needed the money, there was no denying that, but at what cost? Her phone buzzed and she jumped. A text from an unknown number read, Mr. Callahan needs your decision by tomorrow. He doesn't wait long. Claire stared at the message, her heart pounding. She glanced at the small wooden carving Earl had given her. 2 hands clasped together, a symbol of kindness and connection. Suddenly she wasn't sure what to do. At ease. Claire woke to a restless mind, her thoughts still tangled from the previous day's meeting with David Callahan. The quiet hum of her coffee maker filled the kitchen as she sat at the small table, staring at the community center schedule spread out before her. The decision loomed over her like a storm cloud. What if I'm making the wrong choice? She muttered to herself. At the community center later that morning, Claire sought refuge in the comfort of Mrs. Harris's calm presence. The older woman sat across from her in the break room, nursing a cup of tea. Claire's voice trembled slightly as she admitted her fears. What if turning this down means the center closes, Mrs. Harris? What if I can't fix this? Mrs. Harris set her cup down and looked at Claire with the same quiet strength she'd always admired. Claire, sometimes saying no is harder than saying yes. But if we lose who we are, what's the point of saving the center? Her words settled over Claire like a balm, giving her clarity where doubt had clouded her judgment. It's not about keeping the doors open at any cost, Mrs. Harris continued softly. It's about what's inside those doors. The people, the trust, the hope. That's what you're fighting for. Claire nodded, her resolve building. You're right. We'll figure it out, no matter what. The afternoon brought a whirlwind of activity as the food drive entered its final triumphant day. The community center buzzed with energy as tables overflowed with donations. Families arrived with smiles, clutching boxes and bags to take home for the holidays. Volunteers worked tirelessly, the shared sense of purpose radiating through the room. Earl Jenkins, wearing an old suit jacket and a proud smile, took the floor. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he addressed the crowd. I used to think there wasn't much left for me, that maybe the world didn't have a place for people like me anymore. But this center, all of you, gave me a second chance when I needed it most. One act of kindness changed everything. His words struck a chord in Claire, bringing tears to her eyes. Around her, heads nodded and hands clapped. The truth was undeniable. This place was far more than bricks and mortar. It was hope made tangible. That evening, Claire stood once again in David Callahan's pristine office. The city lights glimmered through the windows as he greeted her with that same polished charm. I take it you've come to accept my offer, Callahan said, settling behind his grand desk. He gestured toward a sleek folder in front of him. Let's make this official. Claire inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Mr. Callahan, I appreciate what you're offering, but I can't accept your terms. His smile faltered, replaced with an expression of cool disbelief. You're turning down millions of dollars to save the center? Claire, be reasonable. Think about the future. Claire's voice was calm but unwavering. The center isn't for sale. It's not just a building, it's a home. The people who come there, they're not projects to streamline. They're a community, and that's something you can't buy or rename. Callahan's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Opportunities like this don't come around twice. Do you really want to gamble with the center's future? Claire met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. If saving the center means losing its heart, then it's not worth saving. For a long moment, Callahan said nothing. Then he leaned back, his tone cold. You'll regret this, Claire. I don't think I will, she replied softly. With that, she turned and walked out of the office, her steps steady and her heart light. Back at the community center, Claire gathered the volunteers to share the news. At first, there was silence as the weight of the situation settled over them. But then, Lucy clapped her hands together. Well, if we can't rely on some billionaire, I guess we'll have to save the center ourselves. A chorus of agreement rippled through the room. Earl chimed in, his grin infectious. We've been through worse, haven't we? We'll figure it out. Ideas flowed freely. Bake sales, car washes, local fundraisers. The community rallied with renewed determination, and for the first time, Claire realized she'd made the right choice. Mrs. Harris placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. You've reminded them what this place really means. That's worth more than money. As the evening wound down, Claire lingered in the office, tidying up after the successful food drive. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen, an email notification. Anonymous donation received, $25,000. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, the amount blazing back at her like a beacon. Who? She whispered, her voice trailing off. The timing was uncanny, almost miraculous. Somewhere, someone had answered their call for help. But who could it be? Claire sank into a chair, her heart racing as a mixture of relief, gratitude, and curiosity flooded through her. One thing was certain, this fight wasn't over yet. The morning sun filtered through the frosted windows of the Sunset Hills Community Center, casting a soft glow across the room. Volunteers bustled with energy, still celebrating the news of the $25,000 anonymous donation. Boxes of food lined the walls, holiday decorations hung brightly, and the chatter of hopeful families echoed through the hall. Claire stood by the office window, gazing at the scene with a mix of awe and unease. The donation had saved them for now, but the mystery gnawed at her. Who would give this much and not want credit? She whispered. Earl Jenkins, standing nearby, chuckled as he adjusted his work gloves. Not everyone needs their name on a plaque, Claire. Some folks help because it's the right thing to do. Claire turned to Earl, her brows furrowed. I need to thank them. Whoever it is deserves to know what this means to us. By mid-morning, Earl had taken it upon himself to dig into the mystery. He spoke with volunteers, neighbors, and anyone who had been involved in the food drive. Little by little, threads began to surface, though none led to a clear answer. Claire busied herself in the office, organizing donation records and supplies. Her phone buzzed with a message from David Callahan. Heard about your good fortune. Told you my influence might come in handy. You're welcome. The message made her stomach turn. David's smug tone and vague claims added to her unease. Was he trying to take credit? He's insufferable, Claire muttered, shoving the phone into her pocket. Earl popped his head into the office, a mischievous grin on his face. Claire, put on your coat. I'm taking you somewhere. What? Earl, Trust me, you'll want to see this. A short while later, Claire found herself at Cafe Willow, a small rustic coffee shop tucked into the edge of town. The smell of fresh brewed coffee mixed with cinnamon greeted her as she and Earl stepped inside. Earl led her toward a corner table where a familiar face sat waiting, Marco Jennings. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. Marco? The man she had helped on the bus weeks ago looked transformed, his clothes clean, his demeanor calm, and a warm smile on his face. Miss Thompson, Marco greeted, rising to shake her hand. It's good to see you again. Claire sat slowly, still processing his presence. Earl settled into a chair beside her, his grin wide. Go on, Marco, tell her. Marco's voice was steady, tinged with gratitude. After that day on the bus, things started to change for me. I got work, steady work. I'm rebuilding my carpentry business, reconnecting with my family. That $5 you gave me? It wasn't just money, it was hope. It reminded me that someone still cared. Claire felt tears prick her eyes as Marco continued. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about you. So I started talking to folks, neighbors, customers, other people who've been helped. We pooled what we could, and that's where the donation came from. Claire's voice trembled. You did this? Marco nodded humbly. We all did. Kindness doesn't stop, Claire, it grows. You showed me that. Tears slid down Claire's cheeks as she tried to speak. I had no idea how much that moment meant to you. Or to me. I don't know what to say. Marco smiled softly. You already said it when you paid my fare. Earl clapped his hands together. Well, there it is. The ripples come full circle. Marco reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden carving wrapped in brown paper. I made this for you. He handed it to Claire, who unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a beautiful carving of a tree, its branches stretching wide and its roots intertwined. It's a tree of roots and growth, Marco explained. Strength and unity. That's what you've built here. Claire traced the smooth lines of the carving, overcome by emotion. Thank you, Marco. I don't deserve this. You do, Marco replied firmly, because you gave first. As Claire and Earl left the cafe, the small wooden carving clutched tightly in her hands. Earl nudged her with his elbow. Told you the answers would come. Claire smiled faintly, the weight in her chest replaced with something warmer. You were right. But Marco's final words echoed in her mind. This isn't just a donation, Claire. There's something more coming your way. What could he mean? And what was next for the community center? And for her? The Sunset Hills Community Center buzzed with quiet anticipation as volunteers and families gathered. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, but a shadow loomed. Claire stood by the windows, the familiar hum of the center around her now tinged with anxiety. Despite the anonymous donation, a new battle had surfaced. The center's lease was up for renewal, and David Callahan wasn't finished. Progress, Claire whispered, shaking her head as she reread the council's agenda. That's what Callahan calls it. Progress at the cost of people. Mrs. Harris approached, resting a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. We've faced storms before, Claire. We'll face this one, too. Claire nodded, drawing strength from Mrs. Harris's calm demeanor. We have to. The City Hall meeting room felt imposing as Claire entered, her nerves a tightly wound knot. Rows of seats filled quickly. Community members, volunteers, families, and even Earl and Marco, all determined to show their support. At the front sat the council, and beside them, Callahan, sharp and confident, his expensive suit cutting a stark contrast to the room's modest attendees. As the meeting began, Callahan wasted no time. This property is prime land, he declared, his voice smooth, measured. It could serve a better purpose, something modern, profitable, and far-reaching. We owe it to the town to look forward. Claire's fists clenched. She could feel the weight of Callahan's words creeping into the room like a chill. But then Mrs. Harris stood, her voice steady and warm. This center is not about buildings or profits, she said. It's about people. People who rely on it as a lifeline. I've seen lives changed here, and you can't put a price on that. The room murmured in agreement, but Claire knew the real fight was hers to take. With a deep breath, she rose and stepped forward. Claire's voice trembled at first, but each word came stronger than the last. This isn't just a building, it's a home. It's where people find second chances, hope, and community. People like Earl Jenkins, who was ready to give up until this center gave him the chance to rebuild his life. People like Marco Jennings, whose kindness brought us all here today. She turned to face the council, her words slicing through the tension. Progress isn't measured in profit margins or shiny buildings. It's measured in lives changed, in children fed, and in families finding hope when they need it most. From the back, Marco stood. His voice carried clear and steady. Claire's kindness saved me when I had nothing. This center, these people, it saved me too. You can't let it disappear. One by one, others spoke. A young mother told of the food pantry that fed her family. Earl shared his journey of finding work and dignity. Lucy stepped forward, speaking passionately about Claire's leadership. The room swelled with voices of unity, each story weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. By the end, the council members sat quiet, their expressions softened. When the vote was called, Claire's heart raced. Motion to renew the community center's lease for the next 10 years. Approved. Cheers erupted across the room. Earl hugged Claire tightly, his eyes glistening. "We did it, Claire." Claire smiled, tears of relief streaking her face. "No, we did it." Back at the community center, the celebration was in full swing. The building, once filled with doubt, now overflowed with joy. Tables lined with food, music drifting through the halls, children laughing. It was everything Claire had fought for. Standing at the front of the room, Claire addressed the crowd, her voice filled with emotion. "This happened because of all of you, because you chose kindness. You believed in this place, in each other, and in something bigger than yourselves." Earl raised a toast, his voice booming. "To Claire, to the center, and to kindness that keeps on growing." The crowd echoed his words, glasses clinking, laughter ringing out. Claire stood off to the side for a moment, watching the community she'd come to love. Marco approached, holding his small wooden carving of the tree. He pointed to it, smiling. "Roots and growth. You planted something here, Claire, and it's going to keep growing." Claire held the carving close, her heart swelling with gratitude. Lucy nudged her playfully. "What's next, local hero? Changing the whole world?" Claire laughed, her eyes shining with possibility. One small act at a time. As the evening wound down, Claire found herself alone in the quiet office. On her desk sat an envelope. She opened it, unfolding a simple handwritten letter. "The world needs more people like you, Claire. Keep shining your light. There's still more to do. This is only the beginning. A friend." Claire smiled, tucking the letter carefully into her pocket. She didn't know who had sent it, but something inside her felt ready for whatever came next. The Sunset Hills Community Center was alive with energy, a testament to what hope and kindness could build. A year had passed since Claire Thompson first paid a stranger's bus fare, a seemingly small act that had rippled across countless lives. Today, the center bustled with families, students, and volunteers, each person part of something greater than themselves. The front doors swung open, and Claire stepped inside, pausing for a moment to take it all in. Children played in the reading corner, their laughter echoing across the hall. A group of job seekers sat eagerly in a workshop, learning skills that would give them a new start. In the kitchen, volunteers prepared meals for families arriving later in the day. The center, once struggling to stay afloat, now thrived. At the entrance stood Marco Jennings' wooden carving of a tree, its intricate roots twisted together, strong and unyielding, its branches stretching upward toward endless possibilities. Beneath it, engraved words glimmered in the morning light. "One small act can change everything." Claire ran her fingers over the carving with reverence. Marco's gift had become the center's heart, its symbol. Turning, she spotted Marco across the room working with a small boy, showing him how to sand a piece of wood. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder, mimicking Marco's steady hands. "You're a natural, kid," Marco said with a grin. His own transformation was unmistakable. Once a man lost in despair, he now ran a small carpentry business, mentoring others and pouring his gratitude back into the community. Claire approached, smiling as she watched the scene unfold. "Looks like you've got an apprentice." Marco looked up, brushing dust off his shirt. "Can't let the next generation miss out on good craftsmanship," he joked. Then more softly, he added, "You know, Claire, none of this would have happened without you." Claire shook her head. "No, Marco. It happened because you chose to pass kindness forward. That's how it works." Nearby, Earl Jenkins sat chatting with a new volunteer, his laughter loud and contagious. Earl was thriving now, a man who'd once needed a hand to pull him back up but had since found his footing and chosen to give back. Every week he showed up to sort donations, mentor younger volunteers, and offer encouragement to anyone who needed it. "Claire," Earl called out, waving her over. "I'm recruiting. We're gonna need more help after all the programs you've added." Claire laughed, feeling the warmth of pride bloom in her chest. It wasn't just the center that had grown, it was the people within it, each one an extension of the ripple that had started so long ago. Earl had been right all along. Kindness didn't stop, it grew. As the afternoon wore on, Claire found herself at the center's main desk, looking over paperwork for new programs. After-school tutoring, a family support group, and even a small job placement program. A lot had changed, but one thing had stayed the same. This place was still a lifeline. "Deep in thought again?" came a teasing voice. Claire looked up to see Lucy holding 2 cups of coffee. Lucy slid one across the desk and perched on the edge of a chair, her smile bright. "Come on, Claire," Lucy teased. "A full year later, and you still haven't slowed down. What's next?" World domination? Claire chuckled, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. One small act at a time, she said with a knowing smile. That's how it starts. Lucy raised her cup. To you, Claire Thompson, the leader we didn't know we needed. Claire smiled, though she knew it was never just about her. She looked around the center again, at the families, the volunteers, the laughter, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. What had started as a moment of instinctive compassion had become something much larger than herself. It was proof that in a world full of challenges, kindness could still shine through. As the day came to a close, Claire sat quietly in her office. The hum of voices outside soothed her, grounding her in the reality of what they had built together. On the wall, the wooden carving of the intertwined tree roots hung proudly, a reminder of the connections that held them all together. Her eyes drifted to the desk, where a sealed envelope lay waiting. Claire picked it up, her fingers running over the handwritten script on the front. She opened it slowly, unfolding the note inside. The world needs more people like you, Claire. Keep shining your light. There is still more to do. This is only the beginning. A friend. Claire tucked the letter into her pocket, her lips curving into a soft smile. Whatever came next, she was ready. Stepping outside, she joined the bustling energy of the community center, the voices of her neighbors, friends, and strangers now bound together by something simple, yet profound. In a world that often felt divided, Claire had learned one undeniable truth. One small act of kindness can remind us of what truly connects us all. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that change lives. Claire's story reminds us that every one of us has the power to make a difference, no matter how simple our actions may seem. Whether it's helping a stranger, volunteering in our community, or just offering a listening ear, these are the moments that bring people together and remind us of our shared humanity. What about you? Have you ever experienced the ripple effect of kindness, either by giving or receiving it? I'd love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below. How can we all do our part to create more moments like Claire's? If you enjoyed this story and its message, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next heartfelt story. Together, let's spread kindness, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay kind and keep creating ripples.